In 11 years of power, Elias Falcone unlocked that greenhouse only once, and it was the night he heard someone moaning inside. The coastal storm had torn down half the pines along the drive, the whole estate had gone dark, and he had only meant to check the generator and go back in. But the brass lock he had fastened himself the day he buried his wife was hanging loose, pried open. He pushed the glass door. Rain drummed on the domed roof like 1,000 fingers. His flashlight swept past the roses that had died of neglect, past the water spreading across the brick floor, and then it stopped. A woman lay curled in the aisle, her maid's uniform soaked through and clinging to her, both arms wrapped around a pregnant belly that not one soul in that house had noticed in 4 months. She looked up, recognized him, and the first thing out of her mouth was not a cry for help. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her lips gone blue. "I've made a mess of your floor." Elias Falcone was a man who could walk down a street and make a whole city lower its eyes. Yet in that moment, a man whose hands had never trembled around a gun felt his fingers turn to ice, because he understood 2 things at once. This woman was going to give birth right there, right then, and the only bridge to the main road had been underwater for hours. What he did not yet know was that she had not wandered onto his land by accident, and that her real name, once spoken aloud, would open a grave he had sealed with his own hands 3 winters ago. If this story of a stormy night has touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, write a few words in the comments, and subscribe to our channel so we can welcome the stories still to come together. He took off his soaking wet wool coat, turned it inside out, and spread it across the tiled floor beneath her. His hand touched her shoulder, and he felt her recoil on instinct, like an animal accustomed to being beaten. It made him freeze for a moment. "No one is going to hurt you," he said, his voice lower than the rain, "but I have to help you lie down. Can you hear me?" She nodded, her teeth chattering. He pulled the radio from his coat pocket, pressed the button, and for the first time in many years, his voice rang urgently through the mansion's communication line. "Mrs. Quinn, the greenhouse. Bring clean towels, warm water, everything you have. Go now." There was silence at the other end for exactly 1 moment. Then the hoarse voice of the Irishwoman answered with only 2 words, and he knew she had understood everything from the sound of his breathing alone. He stood the flashlight upright in a flower pot, casting a trembling circle of light onto the vaulted ceiling. Within that circle, the world shrank until only 3 things remained: the rain striking the glass roof, the woman's breathing, and the pounding of his own heart against both temples. She let out a long moan, struggling to hold it back, the way someone did when she had learned that she wasn't allowed to make noise. He recognized it, and something tightened inside his chest. "You can cry out," he said. "There's no one here for you to disturb. There's a storm outside. No one will hear you." And then she wept, a sob breaking free like something that had been locked away for far too long, merging with the water pouring over the glass dome. Bernadette Quinn appeared in the doorway, her silver hair plastered to her head by the rain, her arms wrapped around a stack of towels beneath her raincoat. She knelt beside them without asking a single question, placed her palm against the young woman's forehead, and spoke in the voice of someone who had done this hundreds of times, long ago. "Look into my eyes, child. Don't look anywhere else." Elias moved back half a step, and she looked up at him. "You stay. The girl needs someone's hand to hold. The man who had once made an entire city lower its eyes, the man who hadn't taken an order from anyone in 11 years, quietly knelt on the wet tiles and held out his hand. She took it. Her fingers, cracked from cleaning chemicals, closed around his hand so tightly that it hurt, and he let them remain there. Time in the greenhouse was no longer measured by anything except the waves passing through her body. Bernadette's steady voice telling her to breathe in and breathe out, and the wavering flashlight beam each time the wind slipped through the gap beneath the door. At times, she went limp, her unfocused eyes staring up at the vaulted ceiling. At times, she whispered something he couldn't quite hear, something that sounded like yet another apology. He bent closer and spoke into her ear, slowly and clearly. "You don't owe me an apology. You only need to finish what you have to do." Then the storm outside seemed to pause for half a heartbeat, and within that stillness, another sound rose, thin, piercing, furious, and utterly new in a house that had known no sound but footsteps for 3 winters. The cry of a newborn child cut through the rain like a knife slicing open a sheet of black cloth. Bernadette wrapped the baby in white towels, checked her quickly with hands that hadn't done this work in 30 years, then looked up with tears reddening her eyes. "She's healthy. She's very healthy." She placed the child in Elias's arms. He received her the way a man might receive something that could shatter beneath a breath too strong, and the arms that had lifted things many times heavier suddenly went rigid because he didn't know how to hold her properly. The tiny life weighed almost nothing, warm and stirring against his chest. He bent down and placed the baby on her mother's chest, and when he straightened, he swept the back of his hand across his face, then stopped. His face was wet. It wasn't rain. For 3 winters, not since the morning they had drawn a white sheet over his wife's face, he hadn't shed another tear. The woman cradled her child against her, turned her face to one side, and let her gaze settle on the glass wall. Condensation lay thick across it, but just beyond that veil of mist, among the pots of roses that had long since withered and died, one small cluster of white flowers still clung to its branch and lived, its petals trembling each time the thunder rolled. She stared at them for a long while. Then she pressed her lips to the baby's forehead and whispered a name so softly that Bernadette had to tilt her head to hear it. Rosie. I'll call you Rosie. Elias Falcone rose to his feet and turned his back so no one could see his face, then looked out into the curtain of water beyond the glass. He believed he had saved 2 lives on a stormy night, and nothing more. He had no idea that the tiny life that had just rested within his 2 hands was the beginning of a thread, and at the other end of that thread, beneath the earth he himself had filled in 3 winters before, a grave was about to be opened. Before dawn, the storm had swept out to sea, leaving behind a gray morning and the sharp scent of broken pine trees hanging over the entire estate. In the small sitting room on the ground floor, which Bernadette Quinn had taken it upon herself to prepare as a place for the young woman to rest, she set another pitcher of warm water on the table and pulled the wool blanket up to the girl's chest. She was asleep, the baby nestled in the cradle of her arm, their breaths falling out of rhythm by a single beat before finding each other again. Bernadette sat down in the wooden chair beside them, her aged hands resting on her lap, and watched as the table lamp cast its light across the girl's face, revealing bruises that had faded to a pale yellow, bruises the loose uniform had concealed remarkably well for the past 4 months. Bernadette had seen them on the very first morning the girl walked into this house, and she had chosen not to tell anyone. The door opened, and Gideon Marsh stepped inside, his shoulders nearly filling the doorway, a thin file in his hand. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried the weight of a boulder rolling slowly downhill. "Do you know what this is, Mrs. Quinn?" The social security number in her file belongs to someone who died a long time ago. The address is a parking lot. The name on these papers doesn't exist. Bernadette didn't take her eyes off the sleeping woman. "I know." Gideon set the file on the table very gently, and it was that gentleness that made him frightening. "Every personnel file has to pass through my hands. Every one of them. No exceptions. Do you understand what could happen if someone managed to put a stranger inside this house without my knowing?" She stood, and though the top of her head reached only to his shoulder, she looked him directly in the eyes. "You want the truth? That day, the girl sat in front of me with her hands shaking so badly that she spilled her glass of water, and she begged me to let her do anything at all. Clean rooms, scrub the kitchen, anything, as long as she had somewhere inside the house to sleep. I asked whether anyone was looking for her. She said there was no one. Mr. Marsh, I've lived long enough to know what it means when someone says those words in a voice like that. I put her file in a drawer, and I didn't submit it. I did it because I chose to. You can report me to him." Gideon looked at her for a long while, then at the wool blanket, then down at the floor. He picked up the file and walked out, but at the threshold he stopped and spoke in a rougher voice. "You don't understand. If I don't know who she is, then I don't know who's looking for her, and I can't protect this house from something I can't see." At that same moment, half an hour away in the southern harbor district, the sea was still black, and murky yellow floodlights shone down over rows of shipping containers stacked like walls of steel. In a small room on the mezzanine of warehouse number 7, a foreman sat across from Elias Falcone, his hands resting on the table, sweat gathering along his hairline despite the cold. Elias didn't shout. He had never needed to. He simply opened the leather briefcase, removed a file, and pushed it across the table. The foreman looked down, and his entire body sagged, because the file contained the papers for the 3-bedroom house in the hills that he had bought for his wife at the beginning of the season, along with a copy of the contract, the name of the bank, and even a photograph taken from the street, showing a woman watering flowers on the porch. Elias turned the tarnished silver ring on his right hand exactly once, then asked a single question in the same calm voice a man might use to ask when a ship was due to dock. "You bought it with my money, so whose house is it now?" There was no answer. No chair fell over, and no one laid a hand on anyone. The foreman left the harbor that same afternoon, leaving his access card on the table and walking away with nothing. And for the entire journey home, he couldn't stop thinking how fortunate he had been, because in the world he had made the mistake of entering, there was a saying people repeated to one another like a daily prayer, that the Falcone family doesn't ask, the Falcone family doesn't explain, and the Falcone family doesn't forgive. When Elias returned to the mansion at noon, the house held a sound it hadn't known in 3 winters, the faint fussing of a baby drifting from the sitting room on the ground floor. He stopped in the middle of the hallway and listened. Then he climbed the stairs, past his own bedroom, and stopped before the door at the far end of the second-floor corridor, the only door in the house that had remained locked for 3 winters, and that no one was permitted to open, not even the cleaning staff. He placed his palm on the cold brass handle. He stood that way for a very long time, long enough to hear the baby downstairs cry out once more. Then he drew his hand away, turned his back on the door, and went downstairs. The following afternoon, Bernadette carried a tray of food into the sitting room on the ground floor and paused in the doorway to watch the girl eat. She ate very quickly. It wasn't the way a hungry person ate, but the way someone ate when she was accustomed to finishing her meal before anyone could come through the door. Bernadette placed a hand on her shoulder as she reached for the tray, and the girl jerked violently, sending the spoon tumbling onto the carpet. "I'm sorry," she said at once, bending down to pick it up. Bernadette knelt first, took hold of her wrist, and said in her rough voice, "In this house, when you drop something, all that happens is that you dropped it. Nothing comes after." The girl looked up at her and couldn't find a single word to say. That evening, after the baby had fallen asleep in the wicker basket beside the bed, Elias knocked on the door. He didn't enter immediately. He remained in the doorway, holding an oil lamp, because the generator was still running at reduced power. "I need to know your name," he said. "Your real name, not the one in the file." She was silent for a very long time, both hands gripping the edge of the blanket, and he looked at them, at the fingers cracked by bleach that belonged to a woman who wasn't yet 30. "Adeline," she said at last. "Adeline Vance." The surname fell into the room like a stone dropped into a deep well, and Elias stood motionless, waiting for the echo. He set the lamp on the table, pulled out the wooden chair, and sat far enough from her bed that she wouldn't have to look up at someone standing over her. "Tell me," he said, "from the beginning. I have all night." And she told him, slowly, her voice flat and steady, as though she were reciting a list rather than recounting her own life, because she had rehearsed it in her mind so many times that every feeling had been worn smooth. She told him about the 3 years she had spent living in an apartment on the 40th floor of a building overlooking Boston Harbor, where the windows couldn't be opened for safety reasons, where every morning she stood looking down at the tiny people below and wondered where they were going. She told him it hadn't begun with shouting, but with things that looked like concern. He told her she didn't need to work anymore. Then he told her that having a separate account only complicated the family finances, and it would be better to combine everything in one place. Then her bank card expired, and no new one arrived. Then her phone broke, and the replacement could call only 3 numbers. She told him about an evening when she wanted to call the only friend who still kept in touch, and realized she couldn't remember the number because she hadn't dialed anyone herself in more than a year. She told him that her driver's license had expired without anyone mentioning it, that her medical card had been changed to his name, that the household manager collected her mail, and that little by little, the name Adeline vanished from the records of the world until she could no longer prove that she existed. "No one locked me inside," she said. "The door was always open. It was just that if I walked through it, I wasn't anyone anymore." Elias didn't ask about the marks on her face. He saw the way she sat with her back pressed against the wall, and he understood. Then she reached the final part of her story, and this was the only part where her voice changed. When her husband's mother learned she was pregnant, the woman invited her to a tea room in one of the family's hotels, ordered her a cup of tea that she never drank, then pushed a stack of papers across the table, already typed and lacking only a signature. They were documents in which she would voluntarily surrender her rights as a mother. The woman wore silk gloves. She spoke very gently. She said arrangements would be made for Adeline to receive enough money to live in another city, and that this was best for everyone. "She didn't threaten me once," Adeline said. "She just handed me the pen." as though everything had already been decided, and all I had left to do was sign. She stopped, and for the first time in the entire story, her eyes reddened. I didn't sign. That was the only time in 3 years that I said no. Outside, the wind was still lashing the broken rows of pine trees. Elias sat motionless, turning the silver ring on his right hand exactly once. My wife's name was Rosalind, he said briefly, offering nothing more, and the entire room understood that this was all he intended to say about it. Then he stood, picked up the lamp, and looked at her. Listen carefully. On this land, no one can touch you. Not because I'm kind, because this is my land. Adeline nodded. She thanked him softly and let him leave the room without trying to stop him, because there was one thing she had deliberately left out. She hadn't arrived at these gates by chance. During those 3 years on the 40th floor, there was one name her husband and his mother had repeated, behind half-closed doors, always with a voice that carried both contempt and the instinctive hush of fear. That name was Falcone, and she had made certain never to forget it. Over the next few weeks, Ashgrove began to make sounds it had forgotten long ago. In the great kitchen, the bottle warmer clicked once and fell silent while the sky was still dark. Along the ground floor corridor came the rough lullaby of Bernadette, an old song in the language of her homeland, whose words no one in the house understood, though they understood that hearing it made them want to sit down. And in the small sitting room was a sight no one beyond those walls would ever have believed: Gideon Marsh, a man whose shoulders were so broad that he had to turn sideways to pass through a narrow doorway, sitting on the edge of a chair with both arms extended stiffly before him, while Bernadette scolded in a low voice, "Support her head, Mr. Marsh. Her head. She can't hold it up by herself yet." He obeyed, sweat gathering on his forehead. And for the rest of that afternoon, he didn't dare speak above a murmur. But the thing that changed the house most came from somewhere else. Elias discovered it one morning before dawn, when he came downstairs to get his car keys. The entire first-floor corridor gleamed, the scent of lemon soap still damp in the air, and at the far end, Adeline was kneeling as she finished cleaning the baseboard, a plastic bucket beside her feet, and the cloth wrung completely dry. He stopped. "Mrs. Quinn told you that you weren't to work." She rose, her hands still wet, and this time she didn't lower her face as she had before. "Sir, you've given me a place in this house, food to eat, a wicker basket for my child, and warm blankets. I have nothing to give in return. If I keep lying there and accepting more, then one day I won't dare look anyone in this house in the eyes." She paused for a moment, then continued, her voice still soft but steady. "I don't know how to live by depending on someone else. I was taught that if I'm not useful, I have no right to stay. I know you don't believe that, but I haven't managed to get it out of my head yet. Either you let me work, or you let me leave." Elias didn't answer at once. He looked down at the place where she had been kneeling. It was the hand-woven rug Rosalind had bought on a journey far from home, the rug that someone came to the house to care for personally every season. And he suddenly realized something that left a bitter taste in his throat. That rug beneath her knees was worth more than 3 years of wages for a maid in his household. She was cleaning it with the same cracked hands no one had ever thought to ask about. He felt ashamed. Not ashamed of her, but ashamed that for 4 months she had walked through this house and scrubbed these floors. And he hadn't once taken the time to look closely at her face. "If you want to work, then work," he said at last. "But not on the floors, Mrs. Quinn needs someone to manage the linen room and the kitchen expense ledgers. You'll be paid weekly, just like everyone else in this house." Then he turned away, and no one knew what he went upstairs to do. That afternoon, as Bernadette carried a tray downstairs, she passed the foot of the staircase and stopped dead. Elias was descending with a large object wrapped in a dust-covered cloth cradled in his arms. He placed it in the middle of the sitting room on the ground floor and pulled away the cloth. It was a wooden cradle, walnut, fitted together with joints rather than a single nail, with 2 curved runners underneath polished so smooth that they felt like silk beneath the hand, and a rose branch carved into the headboard, unfinished, ending halfway through a leaf. He took a damp cloth and wiped it from top to bottom, cleaning every joint, even the underside where no one would ever look, working very slowly for a very long time without saying a word. Then he turned the cradle to face the window, stood, and brushed his hands against his trousers. Adeline stood in the doorway with the baby in her arms, afraid to step inside. Bernadette set down the tray, walked past her, and said only one thing: so quietly that it was almost meant for her ears alone. That door hadn't been opened in 3 winters. Then she bent down, took the baby from the young woman's arms, and placed Rosie inside the cradle. It began with something so small that almost no one noticed. On the first afternoon, a gray car parked across the road, several dozen yards from the gate, beneath the bare branches of a maple tree. It remained there until the porch lights came on, then drove away. On the second afternoon, it returned, taking the same place at the same time. On the third afternoon, the gatekeeper wrote down the license plate number and reported it, and Gideon Marsh had someone investigate. The plate was registered to a car rental company. That company belonged to another company. The other company had an address matching the 18th floor of an office building in Boston. There was nothing to challenge, nothing to report, and not a single law had been broken. Then, on the 4th morning, the mailman brought an envelope. It was cream-colored and made of heavy paper, with no stamp and no return address, only the name of the estate printed across the front. Gideon opened it in the study with Elias watching. There were 2 things inside. The first was a photograph taken from a distance, from the slope of the hill on the other side of the road, showing Adeline hanging diapers on the clothesline behind the house, her hair hastily pinned up, one hand holding the laundry basin, her face turned slightly to one side and peaceful. The image was so clear that even the wooden clothespins were visible. The second was a business card. It bore only the name of a Boston law firm, a telephone number, and a small line identifying family law as its area of practice. There wasn't a single handwritten word. Not a threat. Not a demand. Gideon placed both items on the desk and spoke in a very low voice. "I'd feel better if they had sent us an insult." Elias picked up the photograph and turned it beneath the lamplight, and he understood at once what the sender wanted him to understand. They were saying they knew she was here. They were saying they could watch her from beyond his fence. They were saying they didn't need to come closer, didn't need to break down a door, didn't need a man carrying a club, because the weapons they intended to use weren't fists, but papers filed with the court. Every one of them polite, procedurally correct, and perfectly legal from beginning to end. It was that very politeness that sent a chill down the spine. Gideon waited until Elias set the photograph down, then said what he had been thinking since morning. "Sir, I know where that car parks. I know who sits inside it. All I need is a nod, and this will be over before dawn. No one will find anything. This house has done things like that many times before, to people who gave us far less reason." Elias didn't answer. He rose and walked to the large window overlooking the drive, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the sky had turned the color of lead. The fallen pine trees still hadn't all been cleared away, and the evening shadows were slowly creeping up the stone steps. He stood there for a very long time. In his mind, every detail had already been arranged. He knew how many men he would need, which stretch of road to choose, who would take care of what remained, and who would never open his mouth. He knew that if he handled it that way, everything would end in a single night, and he also knew that for the past 11 years, this was precisely how he had ensured that people lowered their voices whenever they spoke his name. His right hand turned the silver ring once, then a second time. Gideon saw it and waited in silence, because he had followed this man long enough to know that the second turn usually meant an order was about to be given. Then, from the floor below, through 2 layers of wooden flooring and a long corridor, came a very faint sound. It was the baby in the wooden cradle, not crying, only making one long, soft murmur that faded away, the kind of sound a tiny living soul made when she shifted in her sleep. Elias's hand stopped on the ring. He continued looking through the window for another moment, then spoke in a voice so calm that it sounded colder than anger. "No, not yet." Gideon bowed his head slightly and left, but all the way down the corridor, throughout that night, and for many nights afterward, those final words remained lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Elias hadn't said never. He had said not yet. Less than a week later, the gray car stopped coming. In its place, on a morning washed in pale sunlight, 3 black cars traveled slowly in single file up the road toward the main gate, openly and without concealment. Like a procession of invited guests, the gatekeeper called the house. Elias stepped out onto the stone steps, unarmed, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows, and stood there waiting. The man who emerged from the first car was a little over 30, with neatly combed blonde hair and a coat tailored perfectly down to the last stitch, and the first thing he did was smile. It was a beautiful, warm smile, the kind that appeared in photographs taken at charity fundraisers. He extended his hand before he was close enough for a handshake, a gesture that was both friendly and slightly unnecessary. "Elias," he said, addressing him by his first name as though they had shared dinner many times. "I'm Garrett Vance. I apologize for arriving without notice. I thought this should be discussed between two men, instead of letting everything make its way back and forth through letters." Elias didn't take his hand. He looked at the two men in suits standing behind Garrett, each carrying a leather briefcase, and said, "You brought lawyers to a conversation between two men?" Garrett laughed it off, his voice remarkably pleasant. "They're only here to handle the paperwork. I want to speak plainly. Elias, this is nothing more than a family misunderstanding. My wife has mental health problems, something my family has been monitoring for a long time, and we have complete records. She left home while she wasn't in a sound state of mind. I don't blame you for giving her shelter. Honestly, I'm grateful. But it's time for her to come home." One of the two lawyers stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and removed a bound stack of papers. "This is a petition requesting a routine inspection of the conditions in which the child is being cared for. It has been filed and stamped as received. We are merely notifying you in accordance with proper procedure." Elias glanced at the papers but didn't take them. He looked at Garrett for a very long time, long enough for the smile on the younger man's face to begin stiffening at the corners of his mouth. Then he spoke in a slow, even voice, like a man reciting an inventory. "Vance Hospitality has 3 syndicated loans due for restructuring within the next 9 months. The largest is led by a credit fund in Hartford. The man in charge is named Delaney, and he has postponed his meeting with your people twice. The second is secured by 3 coastal hotels, whose occupancy rates have fallen below the levels you promised. You're trying to let the third one pass quietly, because if anyone takes a close look at it, the other 2 will collapse with it." He paused for a moment. "And all the furnishings for your 3 new hotels are imported, packed in containers, and unloaded at Pier Number 7. Do you know who signs the papers allowing cargo to leave Pier Number 7? No one said a word. The wind swept through the courtyard, carrying the scent of pine resin. Garrett's smile disappeared entirely, and for one brief moment, his face revealed what lay beneath the polished surface. Something petty and bitter. Then he brought himself under control, nodded, and fastened the button of his coat. He turned his back and descended the stone steps, but when he reached the last one, he stopped without looking around and spoke just loudly enough for Elias alone to hear. "You control what happens on your land, Elias, but the court isn't on your land." The 3 black cars departed as slowly as they had arrived. Throughout that morning, Rosie slept in the wooden cradle in the sitting room on the ground floor, separated from the stone steps by 2 walls and a long corridor, and no one in the house mentioned what had happened at the gate when Adeline entered the kitchen. But that same afternoon, Elias went into his study, closed the door, and made 3 telephone calls, none lasting more than a few sentences. Several days later, 2 ships carrying furnishings for Vance Hospitality remained at Pier Number 7 because of a problem in their declaration papers, the kind of problem that, according to one harbor employee, could have been cleared in a single morning if anyone had been willing to clear it. That same week, the contractor building the lobby of the new hotel abruptly sent a letter withdrawing from the project, citing a shortage of workers. By the end of the week, a local newspaper published a lengthy analysis of the debt carried by coastal hotel chains in the region, accompanied by a small chart in which one name appeared in bold print. The article didn't accuse anyone of anything. It merely presented figures that had always been available in public records, figures that no one before then had ever bothered to add together. The breach was so small that if Gideon Marsh hadn't been the kind of man who personally reviewed the entire system log every morning, no one would ever have discovered it. In the record from the previous night, there was a gap exactly 4 minutes long, during which every camera in the mansion lost its image at the same time. It wasn't a malfunction, and it wasn't a power failure, because all the other equipment had continued operating normally. There were simply 4 minutes in which nothing had been recorded. Gideon went down to the storage room in the basement, opened the cabinet containing personnel files and the family's household documents, and stood there for a very long time before the drawer from which something had been taken. The copy of Rosie's birth certificate, the document Bernadette had gone to great trouble to obtain for the baby, was gone. Only 7 people in the house knew the code to the basement door. It took him a day and a half to eliminate them one by one, and on the second night, he knocked on the door of Elias's study and placed a single printed sheet on the desk. It bore the name Curtis Pruitt, the estate manager, 11 years of service. The man who personally inspected every bouquet in the entrance hall each morning to make certain not a single stem had wilted. Half an hour later, Pruitt was brought into the study. In the courtyard, a car was already running with its headlights off, and 2 men stood beside it without speaking. Inside, Elias sat behind the desk. Gideon stood by the door, and no one invited Pruitt to sit. He didn't ask to sit either. He stood straight with his arms at his sides, and when Gideon placed the sheet of paper before him, he merely glanced at it and looked up. "Yes," he said. "It was me." The entire room fell silent. It was the kind of silence everyone in this house understood. It was the space between the moment an answer was spoken and the moment a head nodded, and that nod would send the car in the courtyard rolling away, after which no one in the house would ever mention the name Curtis Pruitt again, as though no one bearing that name had ever crossed this threshold in 11 years. Pruitt understood that better than anyone, because he himself had once handled the documents, the contracts, even the expenses the ledgers recorded under another name. He didn't beg. He didn't fall to his knees. He merely drew a breath and spoke in a voice made hoarse by the effort to keep it steady. "Sir, I'm not asking you to spare me. I know the rules of this house. I only ask one thing. My daughter mustn't know how her father left this world. Tell her I went away for work. Tell her anything you like. Just don't tell her the truth." Then, with a trembling hand, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Gideon stepped forward, but the only thing Pruitt withdrew was a photograph with worn corners. He placed it on the desk, turned it the right way around, and pushed it toward Elias. The photograph showed a woman in her 20s, her hair tied high, wearing a pale blue hospital gown, sitting on the edge of a bed and shaping her hands into a heart for the camera. She was smiling with the strained determination of someone trying to reassure the person taking her picture. "She's been waiting for a transplant for more than a year," Pruitt said. "3 months ago, they summoned me upstairs. It wasn't a doctor. It was a man in a suit, sitting in a room used by the hospital board. He told me who owned that hospital. He said my daughter was on the list, and that the list was arranged by people. He didn't threaten me once, sir. He only asked whether I wanted to help with one very small thing." He stopped, and for the first time, his voice broke. "I've been in this house for 11 years. I know what kind of man you are, but she's my daughter." Elias said nothing. He picked up the photograph, studied it for a very long time, then set it down with the image facing the desk. Gideon remained by the door, waiting. From the courtyard, the steady rumble of the engine drifted through the window panes. Then, from the far end of the ground floor corridor and through 2 closed doors, came the faint sound of a rough lullaby, the old song in a language no one in the house understood. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he pushed the photograph back toward Pruitt. "Take it," he said, "then go home to your daughter." Pruitt stood frozen, his shoulders beginning to tremble beyond his control. Elias continued, his voice as calm as ever, though this time something in it had shifted beyond the boundaries of its old form. "If I follow tonight the rules I've lived by for 11 years, then one day, when the little girl downstairs grows up and asks me what I do for a living, how will I know what to tell her? Go, Mr. Pruitt. Don't come back. And don't tell anyone that I let you leave." On the morning of her follow-up appointment, Adeline stood by the kitchen window waiting for Bernadette to finish getting ready, and she watched the road beyond the gate out of a habit she couldn't break. 3 years on the 40th floor had taught her something no one ever wanted to learn: how to count. To count how many times a car passed, to count the intervals between each pass, to count how many seconds someone looked in her direction. She had counted 4 passes. The same graphite-colored car had gone up the road, then back down, then up again, with roughly a quarter of an hour between each pass, and all 4 times it had slowed noticeably as it passed the gate. She went down to the study and knocked on the door. "There's a car outside that has passed 4 times, she said. "A dark-colored car. It slows down when it reaches the gate." Gideon looked up, and in that moment, he regarded her in a way he never had before. "You're certain it was 4? She nodded. "I'm always certain about that." He didn't ask another question. He changed the route, sent 2 cars instead of 1, and drove the second car himself. The coastal road was buried in fog that day. It was so thick that from inside the car, all they could see was the yellow center line appearing and vanishing, while to their right, beyond the steel guardrail, lay a bottomless expanse of murky white with the sea somewhere beneath it. The car carrying Adeline and Bernadette traveled ahead, with Gideon following several car lengths behind. It happened at the wide curve near the rocky point. From the fog behind them, two beams of light suddenly appeared very close, far closer than they should have been. An engine roared. Then came an impact. Not hard, but delivered in precisely the right place and at precisely the right angle. The kind of impact made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Tires shrieked across the damp pavement, a long, piercing sound, followed by the screech of metal scraping against the steel guardrail, like someone tearing a sheet of tin in half. Inside the car, Bernadette wrapped both arms tightly around Adeline's shoulders and held on. The car shuddered to a stop, tilted sharply to one side against the guardrail, and for several seconds, there was nothing but the breathing of the two women. Then the rear door was yanked violently. Figures moved in the fog, and someone called her name, not Adeline, but the surname she had spent 3 years wishing never to hear again. What froze the blood in her veins was that the voice wasn't angry. It was calm. It was polite. "Mrs. Vance, the car is waiting. We're only taking you home." She understood then, and that understanding was colder than fear. They hadn't come to hurt her. They had come to take her away. People only took what they still needed to use. Then the car behind them surged forward. Gideon didn't brake. He drove his vehicle directly into the space between Adeline and the figures in the fog. And another crash followed, short and heavy. Then came the sound of feet running across wet pavement, car doors slamming, and an engine fading into the distance. The fog closed around them again, and the road returned to silence as though nothing had ever happened. When Bernadette managed to open the door and climb out, she saw Gideon Marsh leaning against the door of his car, one hand braced on the hood, every breath broken by pain. He managed only 3 words. "How is she?" The county hospital determined that he had broken 2 ribs. They wrapped his chest, told him to remain still for several weeks, and forbade him from lifting anything. That afternoon, Adeline came to visit with Rosie in her arms, because she couldn't bear to leave the baby at home, while Bernadette followed behind carrying the blanket. The hospital room was small, with afternoon sunlight falling through the curtains, and the smell of coffee drifting in from the corridor. Gideon lay in bed, his face still pale, and gazed at the baby in Adeline's arms for a long while. "May I hold her for a moment?" he asked, his voice terribly hoarse. Bernadette scolded under her breath that he had broken ribs, not an afternoon to spare, but she was still the one who carefully lowered Rosie into his arms and placed another pillow beneath his elbow so he wouldn't have to strain. The broad-shouldered man lay as still as stone, slowly closing both arms around the baby, hardly daring to blink. Rosie slept, one tiny hand stretching beyond the edge of the blanket. He stared down at that hand for a very long time. Then he spoke so softly that Adeline had to bend closer to hear him. "For 41 years, I've held all kinds of things that made other people step back when they saw them. Nothing has ever frightened me the way this does. I'm afraid that if I hold her wrong, I'll break her." Adeline couldn't answer. She simply stood there, and for the first time since the night in the greenhouse, she wept without feeling that she owed anyone an apology for her tears. The night Gideon lay in the hospital, Elias didn't return to his bedroom. He remained in the study beneath the only desk lamp still burning anywhere in the mansion, and spread before him were the documents he had long allowed other people to read on his behalf. He didn't look for the man who had been driving. A driver could always be replaced. He looked for the wallet that had paid the driver, and to find that wallet, he had to follow the money, because money always left a trail. He had his people obtain every public record connected to the Vance Corporation, documents that had been sitting in the corporate registry all along without anyone bothering to read them, then spread them across the long table, and began peeling back the layers one by one. Vance Hospitality sat on the outside, brightly lit and carefully branded, with photographs of hotel lobbies printed on the covers of its reports. Beneath it was a property management company. Beneath that was a family investment fund, and that fund held shares in 4 different branches, each bearing a name so bland that anyone who read it forgot it at once. He followed them one by one, slowly, like a man feeling for each step of a staircase in the dark. At the 3rd branch, he stopped. It was called Vance Health, and within it was a portfolio containing several private clinics, a medical equipment supplier, and a healthcare facility on the western edge of Providence. The facility was called St. Bridget's. Elias sat motionless for a very long time. The desk lamp gave a small crackle as the bulb grew hot. He read the name again, then once more, as though waiting for it to become something else. It didn't. He knew its gates, knew the parking area, Knew the terrazzo corridor leading from the lobby into the inner wing, even knew the smell of disinfectant mingling with the flowers arranged in a vase at the reception desk. 3 winters earlier, he had sat in a plastic chair in that corridor. He remembered the row of ceiling lights casting a pale white glow across the stone floor, a light that made no shadows. He remembered the door at the end of the corridor, the door that had already closed by the time he reached it, and the people who told him to stop. And he remembered Rosalind's coat, still draped over the back of the chair beside him, while the chair itself sat empty. He had never asked who owned that hospital. Not once in 3 winters had the question entered his mind, because when a man lost the most precious thing in his life, he didn't think about the name of the person who owned the building where it happened. Before dawn, Elias took the car and left alone. He didn't call anyone or tell anyone where he was going. He drove along the coastal road, still wet with mist, past the same curve where the steel guardrail had been crushed inward along a long stretch several days earlier, then turned into the city. He parked across the street at an angle from the main gate, shut off the engine, and sat motionless inside. Before him, the 4-story red brick building stood silent, with lights already glowing in several upper windows for the early shift. Beside the gate, mounted on the brick wall, was a tarnished brass plaque engraved with the name of the facility, and, beneath it, a smaller line naming the organization that operated it. From inside the car, that smaller line was only a faint blur of light. He already knew what it said. He sat there until the sky began to brighten, until the first cars turned into the parking lot, and people in blue scrubs stepped out holding cups of coffee, talking to one another about the ordinary concerns of an ordinary day. He didn't get out of the car. There was nothing inside for him to ask, because the real question wasn't waiting beyond those gates. It was waiting at home. It was inside a safe in his study, where a thin file had been kept for 3 winters. A file he had paid dearly to have investigated down to its deepest roots. A file he had read exactly once before putting it away. The man who had brought that file back and placed it on his desk that day. The man who had sat beside him and said there was nothing suspicious, that it had been a tragic accident, that he should stop digging and allow his wife to rest, was Clement Voss, the man who had carried Elias in his arms before Elias had learned to walk. Elias started the engine, turned the car around, and throughout the entire drive home, he thought of only one thing, that the first thing he would do when he reached the house was open that safe again. He arrived home after the sun had risen above the pine trees, went straight into his study, and locked the door behind him. The safe was concealed behind the landscape painting beside the fireplace. The file remained exactly where he had left it, thinner than he remembered, the edges of its cardboard cover yellowed with age. He placed it on the desk and opened it for the first time in 3 winters. The last time, he had read it the way a man who had just lost his wife read everything, his eyes passing over the words while his mind absorbed none of them. This time was different. This time, he read it as he would a cargo ledger at the harbor. Every line, every number, every name. In the middle of the file was a medical report documenting the events of that night, typed on paper bearing the facility's letterhead, with a section at the bottom of the page for the signatures of the staff on duty. There were 3 signatures. The first 2 belonged to doctors. The third appeared on the line marked night nurse, written in the firm, slanting hand of someone who had signed that name thousands of times in her life. Bernadette Quinn. Elias sat motionless. Footsteps passed in the corridor outside. Someone carried a tray of dishes toward the kitchen, and from the far end of the house came the faint sound of that rough lullaby in a language no one in the house understood. He listened until the song ended. Then he picked up the report and went downstairs. Bernadette was in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, arranging a stack of clean towels. He placed the paper on the wooden table, turned it so that it faced her, and didn't say a word. Bernadette looked down. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't pick it up for a closer look. Her hands slowly lowered the stack of towels onto the table. Then she gripped the edge and collapsed to her knees on the tiled floor. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I've been waiting for it for 3 winters." Elias remained standing, still saying nothing. She continued, each sentence breaking away from the next, her voice splintering into pieces. "I was on duty that night. There were things that should have been done sooner. I said so. I told them twice. Then, in the morning, they gave me that paper. It had already been typed, and all it needed was my signature. It said everything had been done at the proper time and in the proper way. I read it. I knew it wasn't true, and I signed it anyway." She swept the back of her hand across her face. Someone stood there and watched me sign. He said that if I didn't, the entire department would be dragged into it, that I was about to retire, and that my pension was calculated according to my years of service. He spoke very kindly. He didn't threaten me once. She raised her head, and for the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. The next morning, I handed in my resignation, 30 years in nursing, and I walked away from it in a single morning. Then, a few months later, someone came to my home, Mr. Voss. He said there was a position at Ashgrove, that the house needed a housekeeper, that the pay was good, and the work was easy. At the time, I thought he felt sorry for me. Later, I understood that he wanted me somewhere he could see me every day. She fell silent for a very long time. I still came here. Do you know why I came anyway? Because I could no longer bear to live in my own home. I thought that if I entered this house and served it until the day I died, perhaps I might be able to sleep. But for 3 winters, I've seen that corridor again every night. Elias remained silent. She lifted the hem of her apron and wiped her face, then spoke one final sentence. And it was this that made him turn away. The day that girl Adeline sat before me and asked for work, her hands shaking so badly that she spilled her glass of water. I looked at her wrists, and I saw the way she sat with her back against the wall. I knew at once what was happening to her, and I told myself, not this time. This time, I wouldn't remain silent. I put her file in a drawer. I didn't submit it to Mr. Marsh. I knew what I was doing was wrong. But, sir, I was silent once in my life. That one silence killed a person. The kitchen held no sound but water dripping from the faucet. Elias bent down, picked up the report, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't help her to her feet. He didn't tell her that he forgave her. He spoke only one sentence before leaving the kitchen, his voice raw and hoarse. Get up. The baby will be awake soon, and there's no one down here to prepare her milk. Clement Voss arrived the following afternoon without notice, and entered the study with the bearing of a man who had been accustomed to sitting in the chair on the right for several decades. He placed a thin file on the desk, then sat down and laced his age-spotted hands together. I heard you open the safe again, he said. Before you go any further, I think you should see this. Elias opened the file. Inside were copies of personnel records from a hotel chain bearing the Vance name, including Adeline's name, her position as a housekeeper, and clearly documented dates of employment. There was a copy of her marriage certificate. There was a photograph of her standing beside Garrett at a party, wearing a dark dress with her face turned to one side. And on the final page was a record of the route she had taken after leaving Boston, the buses she had boarded, the places where she had stopped, and at the bottom, one underlined sentence stating that her destination hadn't been chosen by chance. Why do you think that, out of this entire region, the girl happened to find her way to our gates? Voss asked, his voice patient, as though he were instructing a child. Why do you think she asked for work at your house, just when the Vance family needed an excuse to take you to court? The Falcone family doesn't ask, doesn't explain, and doesn't forgive. That is what your father taught you, and I stood beside him when he said it. Now you're sheltering one of their people beneath your roof, and you let her carry her child through your sitting room as though she belongs to this family. Elias didn't answer. He began reading the file again from the beginning, slowly, and immediately saw what made it dangerous. It contained no lies. Every line in it was true. The deception lay in the spaces between those lines, in what had deliberately been left unwritten. That evening, after Rosie had fallen asleep in the wooden cradle, he summoned Adeline to the study and placed the file before her. Read it, he said, then answer one question. Did you come here by chance? Adeline looked down. She turned several pages, and he watched the color drain from her face, not from fear, but from the sight of something she had carried within her for too long finally being dragged into the light. She closed the file, pushed it toward the center of the desk, and looked up. No, she said. It wasn't chance. The room fell silent. She continued in a steady voice that didn't tremble. For 3 years in that apartment, I wasn't allowed to call anyone or leave by myself. But I listened. They thought I was a chair or a curtain, that when I stood there, it was no different from the room being empty. So they talked in front of me, and there was one name that made both mother and son lower their voices whenever they said it. They spoke that name with contempt, but always in the voice of someone who was afraid. That name was Falcone. She drew a breath. The night I escaped, I had no money, no real documents, and no one to call. I had only one thing in my mind, the name whose gates my husband and his mother didn't dare cross. So I went there. I didn't ask for work in your house because I needed somewhere to sleep. I needed somewhere they wouldn't dare enter. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in her entire story, she offered no apology. I used you. I know that. I slept beneath your roof, ate your food, and let you help bring my child into this world while I kept that calculation hidden in my mind. You may call me whatever you like, but at the time, I had no other choice. I had only one move, and I made it. Elias rose and walked to the window, turning his back to her. He had been waiting for her to say no. He had waited the entire evening for a denial, an explanation, anything that would allow him to throw that file into the fire and let the matter end. She hadn't given him one, and the worst of it was that he knew perfectly well that in her place, he would have done exactly the same thing. But for 11 years, the only thing that had kept him alive was never allowing anyone to enter his house while carrying a plan he didn't know about. He turned to look at her, and she recognized that gaze at once, because it was the same gaze he had used for the men standing across the table from him at the harbor. It was the gaze of a man looking at a stranger. "Leave," he said. "I need quiet." That night, around the time the mist began to settle, the gatekeeper recorded in his log that a woman carrying a baby and holding a cloth bag had walked out through the main gate. She didn't ask for a car. She merely asked for directions to the nearest station with a night bus. No one ran after her. No one called the house, because in that household, no one had ever been given an order to make her stay. The motel stood beside the highway, a row of low-roofed rooms painted a peeling blue, with a neon sign out front missing one letter. Adeline rented the room at the far end because its window overlooked the parking lot, and because she needed to see everyone who came in. She paid for 2 nights with small bills counted out from a handkerchief. Rosie slept peacefully on the bed beneath a checkered coverlet, with 2 pillows placed around her like a protective barrier. And throughout the evening, Adeline sat on the edge of the bed watching her daughter breathe, one hand resting lightly on the cloth bag that held everything she possessed in the world. On the second morning, she drew back the curtain and saw a polished black car parked in the middle of the lot, out of place among several long-distance trucks. The person who stepped out was a woman in her 60s, her hair neatly arranged, an ivory wool coat around her shoulders, and silk gloves on her hands. She knocked softly 3 times, the way someone knocked when she knew with certainty that the door would open. Adeline opened it and positioned herself in the narrow space between the door and the frame. "Don't stand in the wind, child," Colette Vance said, and her voice was warm enough that a stranger passing by might have thought she was a grandmother visiting her grandchild. She didn't enter. She looked over Adeline's shoulder at the bed with 2 pillows arranged as a barrier, then turned back, opened her handbag, and withdrew a thin file, holding it out between 2 gloved fingers. "Take it. I think it's time you learned who you are on paper." Adeline didn't take it. Colette placed the file on top of the rusted ice machine beside the door, then slowly turned through the pages with her fingertips, like someone presenting an ordinary contract. "This is the corporate registration for a healthcare facility called St. Bridget's. This is the list of its legal representatives. This is the record of appointment. Look at the final line. That is your signature." Adeline looked down, and her entire body turned cold. The handwriting was hers. She remembered the evening her husband had brought home a thick stack of papers and told her they were documents for the year-end taxes, told her to sign quickly so they could be sent on time, told her simply to sign wherever a colored tab marked the page. She had signed 9 or 10 places. She hadn't read a single line, because during those 3 years, she had learned that reading brought trouble, while signing made everything quiet. "Do you understand now?" Colette asked, still speaking gently. "For years, everything at that facility has been in your name. Every decision, every report, every responsibility. If any violation at that facility comes to light, the person who will have to answer before the court won't be anyone in our family. It will be you." She adjusted the cuff of her glove. "And there's one more thing you must understand clearly. I don't want anything to happen to you. Quite the opposite. If you disappear, people will open the records and begin looking for you. And once those records are opened, everything will be exposed. I need you alive. I need you healthy, obedient, and living somewhere I know. You're the most valuable thing our family possesses, my dear." Adeline stood motionless, and in her mind, hundreds of fragments from those 3 years suddenly came together to form a single picture. That evening in the Boston hotel, when he had sat down at the table she was cleaning and asked her name. The first questions had been so gentle, asking whom she lived with, asking whether her parents were still alive, asking whether she had any brothers or sisters nearby. She had mistaken it for concern. Now she understood that it had been an examination, and she had been chosen precisely because she was an orphan, precisely because she had grown up in foster care, precisely because there wasn't a single person in the world who would come looking if she disappeared. "You chose me from the beginning," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Not because I was gentle, because I had no one." Colette didn't deny it. She merely tilted her head slightly, almost as though offering praise. "You're more intelligent than I thought. Then you're also intelligent enough to understand that you have no choice but to come home." Adeline didn't cry. She didn't retreat, fall to her knees, or beg. She looked directly at the woman in the silk gloves and asked a single question in return. "If I'm as worthless as you told me I was for 3 years, if I'm nothing more than a name for you to place in an empty space, then why did you have to drive all this way yourself this morning? To this motel? Just to tell me that?" Colette Vance faltered. It lasted only a moment, so brief that a blink would have missed it. But it was real, and both women saw it. Then she smiled and fastened the button of her coat. "Think carefully. I'll send someone to collect you tomorrow afternoon." She turned and walked back across the parking lot, her heels striking the concrete in a steady rhythm, while Adeline remained in the doorway and watched until the black car disappeared around the bend in the highway. He found her late that afternoon, before darkness fell, and he came alone. There was no second car, and no one with him, only a man in a wool coat, standing outside the last room in the row, carrying a leather briefcase. Adeline opened the door and blocked the narrow opening just as she had that morning. Elias didn't ask to come inside, nor did he offer an apology, because he knew that under these circumstances, an apology was the cheapest thing a man like him could give. He merely raised the briefcase. "I brought this for you. Once you've read it, if you want me to leave, I'll leave." He placed the briefcase on the small plastic table beside the window, opened it, and removed the files one by one, arranging them in a row. Everything he had uncovered about St. Brigid's, the ownership structure from the outside inward, the list of assets held by Vance Health, a copy of the medical report from the night 3 winters earlier, with 3 signatures at the bottom of the page. And finally, he set down another stack of papers, thinner than the rest, and pushed it toward her. "This one is mine," he said. "It records how I had my wife's case investigated, whom I paid, and whose word I trusted, before closing the case without asking another question for 3 winters. It also contains things I did at the harbor that would send me to prison if they fell into the right hands. I'm giving you everything. You may do whatever you want with it." Adeline looked at that final stack of papers for a very long time. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. They sat across from each other at the plastic table until the light outside the room came on. She told him about the woman in silk gloves who had arrived that morning, about her own signature on the final line of the appointment record, about the thick stack of papers her husband had brought home one evening and called tax documents. Elias listened in silence, both hands resting on the table. And when she reached that part, he asked, "Did you manage to keep anything? Anything at all?" She was about to shake her head. Then she froze. There was one thing she had carried for 3 years without ever once imagining that it might have value. She sprang to her feet, hurried to the bed, bent over the makeshift cradle formed by 2 pillows, and lifted out an old stuffed rabbit, its ears worn thin, and the thread holding one button eye coming loose. It was the only possession she had taken when she escaped, and for the past several weeks, it had lain beside Rosie. She turned the rabbit over, ran her fingers along the seam on its back, and her hand began trembling when she touched a small bulge. "There was one day," she said, her voice unsteady, "when they left a paper on the table. I managed to read a few lines. I didn't understand what it was. I truly didn't. But at the time, I had only one thought. For 3 years, they told me I was imagining things, that I was confused, that I remembered everything incorrectly. I took a picture of that paper, not because I wanted to accuse anyone. I took it so that one day I could look at it again and know for certain that I wasn't losing my mind." She took a small pair of scissors from her bag, cut open the seam along the rabbit's back, reached into the stuffing, and pulled out the cheapest kind of prepaid phone, its plastic casing tarnished with age, along with a battery wrapped separately in a scrap of cloth. Elias said nothing. He rose, took a charger from his briefcase, and plugged it into the room's only electrical outlet. Adeline inserted the battery. The back cover snapped into place with a dry click. She pressed and held the power button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. Still, nothing. The room held only the sound of trucks passing on the highway and the baby breathing on the bed. 3 years buried in the stuffing, 3 years without being charged, carried through several bus journeys and a stormy night in the greenhouse. Adeline sank onto the edge of the bed and covered her face with both hands. Elias remained standing, watching the black screen. Then, slowly, a faint glimmer appeared in the center of the glass, pale and trembling, like something struggling upward from a great depth. The screen flickered once. Then it came fully to life. Adeline crawled closer and took the phone in both hands. She opened the photo folder, and there was only one image inside. She selected it. They both bent down to look, and Elias was the first to speak, his voice raw and hoarse. "This isn't a hospital record." The call came before dawn, and the man calling was Clement Voss. His voice sounded weary over the telephone, almost gentle. "I have what you're looking for, Elias. Not a copy. The original. I left it at warehouse number 11. Come alone, and I'll tell you everything. I owe you that." Elias knew it was a trap by the third word. He went anyway. Warehouse number 11 stood at the eastern edge of the harbor, in a section abandoned long ago, where rows of rusted containers formed a maze and the murky yellow floodlights reached only halfway into the darkness. Inside, the space was vast and empty, the smell of sea salt mingling with old engine oil, and the ceiling was so high that every sound returned with a delayed echo. Voss stood in the middle of the warehouse beneath a hanging bulb, leaning on the cane he had begun using only in recent years. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness, came the sound of people, more than one. "You truly came alone," Voss said, and there was something almost disappointed in his voice. "I had hoped you were wiser than that." Elias stopped about 10 paces away. "How long have you been taking their money?" Voss shook his head, and it was the only honest gesture he made all night. "I never took a single cent from them. Do you think I'm that kind of man? I carried you in my arms before you could walk. I sat at your father's right hand for 20 years. He struck the tip of his cane once against the concrete floor. 3 winters ago, when Rosalind died, you lost your mind. You wanted to drag that hospital into the light. Do you know where our family stood at the time? Our books were under scrutiny. 2 of our docs were tied up in disputes. If you had gone after the Vance family then, they would have torn everything we had wide open, and you would have lost. Not possibly lost. Certainly lost. You would have lost everything. The whole family would have lost everything. And Rosalind still wouldn't have come back." Elias didn't move. "So you falsified the findings." Voss raised his head, and beneath the hanging light, his eyes were wet. "I gave you a piece of paper so you could sleep. I stood beside your father's bed when he drew his final breath, and I promised him I would keep you alive. I kept that promise. You're still here. You still have the house and this harbor. I only took from you a truth you could have done nothing with." He stepped forward. "And what do you intend to do now? Bring our entire family down because of a housemaid?" "The Falcone family doesn't ask, doesn't explain, and doesn't forgive. I taught you those words. Now I have to remind you of them." Then he stepped back, and the figures in the darkness began to emerge. What followed was darkness and noise. Shoes scraped across the concrete floor. An empty steel drum was knocked over, rolled a long way, and crashed into a pillar. Men breathed heavily as they fought for every inch of space between them. Outside, a car turned into the yard, and 2 beams of light swept through the gap beneath the loading door, traveled across the metal wall, illuminated for half a second the shadows locked around one another, then surrendered everything to darkness again. The loading door was forced upward. Many footsteps rushed inside at once, and Gideon Marsh's rough voice rang through the warehouse as he called his employer's name, the voice of a man straining his entire bandaged chest to shout loudly enough. Then everything stopped. When the flashlights swept across the floor, Clement Voss was sitting on the concrete with his back against a steel pillar, his cane lying several paces away, his breath coming in broken gasps. Elias stood before him, the white shirt torn at one shoulder, and remained there for a very long time without speaking. Gideon stepped forward. "All you have to do is nod." Voss looked up at Elias, and he didn't beg. He merely said, "Do it. I know the rules. I'm the man who taught them to you. Elias bent down, picked up the cane, brushed the dust from its handle, then leaned it against the pillar within the old man's reach. "You were wrong," he said. "I'm not going to kill you. If I kill you, then it's over for you. You get to lie down and never see another thing. I'm not giving you that." He straightened. "From tonight onward, your name no longer exists in this house. No one will call you by it again. No one will invite you to sit at the table. You'll keep your home and the name on your gravestone, and you'll live a very long time. You'll live long enough to watch me do what you stopped me from doing 3 winters ago. You'll sit there and watch it all." Then he turned his back and walked out, and behind him, beneath the hanging bulb in the middle of the empty warehouse, the man who had occupied the chair on the right for 20 years remained seated alone, his hand still not reaching for the cane. Adeline and Rosie had been back at Ashgrove for several days, and the prepaid phone lay inside the study safe alongside 3 printed copies of its contents, each stored in a different place. Elias knew that once the other side understood what they were facing, they would stop sending envelopes. He was right. That night, when the fog settled thickly over the grounds, the entire mansion went dark at once. It wasn't a storm or a failure in the power lines, because the streetlights beyond the fence continued burning normally. Someone had found the breaker box in the rear outbuilding and cut precisely the circuit that needed to be cut. In that darkness, inside the small room at the end of the ground floor corridor, the first thing that happened was the striking of a match. Bernadette Quinn had anticipated another loss of power ever since the first night of the storm, and from that day onward, she had always kept matches, candles, and a small flashlight in her drawer. She didn't switch on the flashlight uncovered. She draped a thin piece of gauze over it, leaving the room filled with a honey-colored glow, bright enough for them to see one another but not bright enough to hurt the eyes of a sleeping baby. She closed the door, turned the lock, then pulled the wooden chair close to the cradle. Rosie slept deeply, one hand curled loosely around the edge of the wool blanket, her breathing warm and even. Adeline sat on the floor with her back against the cradle, and Bernadette placed her aged hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Watch her sleep," she whispered. "Don't look at the door. Look only at your child." Then she began to sing. It was the same rough lullaby in the language of her homeland, a language no one in the house understood, sung so softly that it was almost nothing more than breath given rhythm. The candle on the table burned straight and still. Inside that room, there was only the scent of warm wax, the song of an old woman, and the steady breathing of a tiny life that knew nothing of the world beyond the door. And until everything was over, the baby didn't wake even once. Outside, the story unfolded in a different language. Elias and Gideon had already been waiting on the porch before the lights went out, because the neighbor's dog had started barking sometime earlier, and Gideon didn't believe in coincidences. They didn't turn on a light. They stood motionless in the darkness and listened. Shoes scraped against the gravel along the western path. 3 men moving at evenly measured distances from one another. A basement window was pried open, then lowered very gently. Footsteps climbed the wooden staircase, paused at the 4th step where the board always creaked, then continued. Elias knew every step in that house, knew them even better in darkness than in daylight, and that was the only advantage he needed that night. Then came a brief collision in the upper corridor, the sound of a small table toppling over, someone falling onto the carpet, and a sharp breath suddenly cut off. There were no gunshots, no cry louder than a swallowed groan. In less than a quarter of an hour, it was over, and when Gideon found the breaker switch, the lights came back on, illuminating a disordered corridor where 3 men lay face down on the carpet, their hands secured behind them with plastic ties. The leader was a large man with an old tattoo on his wrist, and he raised his head to look at Elias with the expression of someone who knew he was about to be denied another sunrise. Gideon stood behind his employer, waiting. He didn't need to ask. Everyone in this house knew how such matters were handled once they reached this point, because there was a saying people had repeated for years, that the Falcone family doesn't ask, the Falcone family doesn't explain, and the Falcone family doesn't forgive. Elias stood looking at the 3 men on the floor for a very long time. Then he took the telephone from his pocket. Gideon followed the movement of his hand, and his entire body went rigid, because Elias wasn't calling anyone inside the household. He dialed 3 digits. Then he raised the telephone to his ear and spoke in the same calm voice he always used at the harbor. 3 men broke into my home. They've been restrained. No one is seriously injured. The address is Ashgrove Estate on the northern coastal road. I'll preserve the scene and wait for you to arrive. He ended the call. The corridor fell completely silent. Gideon stood there, and in his mind, the words people had always recited, like a daily prayer, suddenly broke into 3 pieces. Elias had asked when he went to knock on the door of someone who had once hunted him. He had explained when he sat in the roadside motel and laid everything out across the plastic table. And tonight, he had forgiven. From the far end of the ground floor corridor, through a tightly closed door, that rough lullaby continued drifting softly through the house, still unfinished. Emmett Doyle's office occupied the 2nd floor above a laundromat in the old neighborhood, reached by a narrow iron staircase behind the building, and the entire corridor always carried the musty scent of steam and soap rising from below. On the frosted glass door was a small line bearing his name, and beneath it, in even smaller letters, a notice offering free consultations to women in need of help. Elias knocked in the middle of the morning. The man in his 60s, sitting behind a desk, piled high with files, looked up and recognized his visitor immediately, because throughout his 12 years as a prosecutor, that face had hung on the wall of his office. Doyle put down his pen. "Get out." Elias didn't move. "I said get out," Doyle repeated, his voice rising. "I spent 12 years pursuing your family. I lost my position, my wife, and every last trace of a respectable name in my profession. And now you walk into my office asking me for help? Get out before I call someone." Elias placed the leather briefcase on the desk, released the locks, and began removing its contents one item at a time. The ledgers kept by 3 generations of harbor managers, lists of expenses the official books recorded under different names, weekly schedules of shipments that had never appeared in any declaration, extending across many years, names of people, names of ships, container numbers. He arranged them in a row across the desk, then stepped back. Doyle looked down. He picked up the first file, turned several pages, and his hand stopped midway. He opened another. Then he looked up, and this time his voice was entirely different. "Do you understand what you've just placed on my desk?" "I understand," Elias said. "It's enough to cost me everything. Take it." Doyle sat motionless for a very long time, then jerked his chin toward the chair across from him. Elias sat down. "Why?" Doyle asked. "Don't talk to me about an awakened conscience. I've done this work for 30 years. I've heard enough of that." "I wasn't going to," Elias replied. "Listen carefully, because this is the real reason. A woman named Adeline is about to go to court. On paper, she is the legal representative of a healthcare facility she has never entered, and the other side intends to place every ounce of responsibility on her. She has evidence, but they won't attack the evidence. They'll attack where she's living and the person protecting her. They'll stand before the court and say this woman abandoned her home to live with a man like me, and once they're able to say that, everything she presents becomes meaningless." He tapped one fingertip against the stack of papers on the desk. "As long as I remain what I am, I'm the most powerful weapon they have, and that weapon is pointed directly at her. So I brought it here and laid it down, not because I'm a good man, because it's the only move left on the table." Doyle studied him for a long time. "That still isn't enough," he said. "A man like you doesn't tear down his own house for the sake of one move." Elias was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice dropping low. "There's a baby in my home. In a few years, she'll learn to speak and ask questions. And one day, she'll sit on my lap and ask what I do for a living. When that day comes, I want to have a decent answer to give her. That's all." Doyle didn't reply. He reached for the telephone on his desk, dialed a number, and spoke with someone at the federal prosecutor's office for nearly an hour. The weeks that followed were the longest of Elias Falcone's life, spent sitting in windowless rooms, answering hundreds of questions, and signing his name hundreds of times. The final result was a cooperation agreement. He didn't go to prison because he had come forward voluntarily, confessed of his own accord, and surrendered every document without forcing anyone to search for it, and because the information he provided opened 3 investigations far larger than his own case. In exchange, he surrendered every unlawful operation, permanently shut down 3 branches of the business, sold 2 docks, paid a fine so large that Gideon had to read the figure twice, and accepted an independent monitor who could enter his office at any time for many years to come. When it was all over, less than 1/3 of the Falcone family's assets remained, and nothing remained of the power that had once made people lower their voices when they spoke his name. Doyle walked him to the top of the iron staircase, and there he offered the only personal words he had spoken throughout the entire process. I still don't like you, but I'll stand beside her in court. The courtroom was so crowded that morning that additional chairs had to be placed in the aisles. On the Vance side, the front row was filled with dark suits, and seated in the center was Colette Vance, wearing her ivory coat, her silk-gloved hands folded one over the other on her lap. Across the aisle were only 4 people: Adeline, Bernadette, Emmett Doyle, and a man seated in the very last row with a wool coat draped across his knees. When her name was called, Adeline rose. She wore the gray sweater Bernadette had pressed the night before. The presiding judge asked her to state her full name. She was silent for exactly 1 moment, and in that moment, the entire room could hear the ceiling fan turning. "My name is Adeline Cross," she said. "Cross was my mother's surname. For 3 years, I wasn't allowed to use that name. Today, I asked to testify under my own name." Doyle didn't ask her about the nights on the 40th floor. He asked very plain questions. Did she have a bank account in her own name? No. Did she have a valid driver's license? No. During those 3 years, how many times had she dialed someone's telephone number herself? Not once. Had she ever read the documents she signed? No. She had been told they were tax papers. Each answer was only a word, and for that very reason, they struck the wooden table like blows from a hammer. Then, Bernadette Quinn was called. She walked forward slowly and gave her testimony without once looking toward the front row. She testified that 3 winters earlier, she had been the night nurse on duty at a healthcare facility, that the following morning she had been given a report already prepared for her signature, that she knew parts of it were false and signed it anyway, and that she submitted her resignation that same day. The opposing attorney rose and challenged her, asking why the court should believe her testimony now, if she had already lied once. Bernadette looked directly at him and said, "The last time, I signed to keep my pension. This time, I'll lose everything by testifying. You decide which time I'm telling the truth." Then came the 3rd witness, and when the clerk read the name Curtis Pruitt, Colette Vance turned her head slightly for the first time that morning. The man who had managed the estate for 11 years walked to the witness stand, much thinner than before, his hat in his hands. He testified that someone from the corporation had approached him, told him who owned the hospital where his daughter was awaiting a transplant, and said that people decided how the waiting list was arranged. He provided the date, the time, the person's name, the amount of money, and even the basement door code he had used. Doyle asked why he was willing to testify now. Pruitt remained silent for a moment before answering, "Because my daughter was transferred to another hospital. I don't know who arranged it. I only received the transfer papers and a message saying someone had taken care of every expense. They don't have anything left to hold over me now, so I'm testifying." In the very last row, the man with the wool coat draped across his knees remained motionless, and no one turned to look at him. That afternoon, the Vance side requested a recess. When the hearing resumed, Garrett Vance's personal attorney rose and announced that his client wished to testify as a cooperating witness. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Garrett took the witness stand with a pale face and no trace of his smile, and he testified that every legal structure within the corporation had been created at his mother's direction, that he had merely signed whatever was placed before him, and that she had personally instructed the legal department on how ownership should be assigned. He said at least 3 times that he hadn't known. Throughout her son's testimony, Colette Vance didn't move, but her silk-gloved hands tightened around each other until the fabric was completely wrinkled. Adeline sat below and looked up at the man who had frightened her so deeply that for 3 years she hadn't dared walk through a door alone, and she realized that he had never been the most powerful person in that apartment. He was only a pawn trying to save himself. The final blow came when Doyle requested permission to present an exhibit. On the large screen in the center of the courtroom appeared a photograph taken with a cheap telephone, slightly crooked, with the shadow of a finger visible in the upper corner. It wasn't a hospital record. It was a confidential internal memorandum sent to the legal department, explaining how to transfer all legal risk associated with the facilities in the healthcare division onto nominal representatives, accompanied by selection criteria that specifically gave preference to people without family ties. At the end of the document was Colette Vance's signature, and beneath that signature, in the appendix, was a list. Doyle enlarged it on the screen. There were 8 names, 8 women, each with a brief note describing her personal circumstances. No one in the courtroom spoke. Somewhere near the back, a pen struck the floor, and everyone heard it. Adeline stared at that list for a very long time, and she understood what the entire courtroom was beginning to understand with her. She hadn't been the first. She was only the first who had managed to take a photograph and preserve it for 3 years inside the stuffing of a cloth rabbit, simply so she could prove to herself that she wasn't insane. The list of 8 names left the courtroom, and no one could contain it anymore. Colette Vance was prosecuted on multiple charges, lost her position as chairwoman before the stock offering, and watched the corporation her family had built over 3 generations broken apart and gradually sold to pay its debts and fines. Garrett Vance vanished from every fundraiser, every newspaper, and every photograph, and people heard that he had moved to an inland state, though no one cared enough to ask anything more. Across the bay, in a neat house with a white painted fence, Clement Voss remained alive and healthy, and still went into his garden every morning. The only difference was that no one spoke his name anymore. There were no telephone calls, no cards, and no visitors. The Falcone family, meanwhile, had been reduced to a small fraction of what it once possessed. 3 docks had passed into other hands, and several times each month, a woman wearing glasses entered Elias's office without knocking, opened any filing cabinet she wished, read any page she needed, then quietly left. That spring, they began restoring the greenhouse. Adeline wanted it, and Bernadette said that an abandoned greenhouse on the estate was no different from a wound that refused to heal. They carried out the pots filled with earth that had hardened solid, scraped the moss from the base of the glass walls, and cleaned the clouded panes so sunlight could reach all the way inside. Elias handled the heavy work, tearing out the rotting wooden shelves and replacing them with new ones. And near the end of the afternoon, he reached the propagation table beside the eastern wall, the table where Rosalind had sat each morning separating the young seedlings. He pulled at the drawer beneath its surface. It was stuck, swollen by dampness, and he had to jerk it twice before it came free. Inside were several packets of ruined seeds, a rusted pair of pruning shears, a faded pair of cloth gloves, and at the very bottom, lying flat beneath the paper lining, an envelope. His name was written across it in handwriting he hadn't seen for 3 winters. He sat down on the wooden chair right there, surrounded by pots and open bags of soil, and opened the envelope. The letter had been written in ink, the handwriting slightly slanted, with several places blurred by a wet hand, and in the upper corner, she had written that she was composing it on the morning she planted the cluster of white roses outside, when she was nearly 7 months pregnant. She wrote that she knew she worried too much and hoped he wouldn't laugh at her, but she wanted to put the words on paper so her mind could rest. She wrote that if she didn't survive, he mustn't do the thing she knew with certainty he would do. She wrote that she knew him too well, knew he would come out here and stand for a very long time, then close the door, lock it, and never return, because he had always dealt with pain by putting it away somewhere and refusing to open it again. She asked him not to lock the greenhouse door. She wrote that flowers needed someone to water them, that glass needed someone to clean it, and that she hadn't built this greenhouse to hold memories of her, but to shelter living things. She wrote that there would be days when he felt he had no reason to rise in the morning, and on those days, he should simply come out here, water something, work with his hands, and the feeling would pass. And in the final line, she wrote that she didn't want him to live the rest of his life as a man guarding a grave, that if someone entered his life one day, he mustn't believe he was betraying her, because the only thing she feared wasn't that he would forget her, but that he would bury himself beside her. Elias sat motionless for a very long time, holding the paper in the calloused hands of a man in his 30s. The afternoon light slanted through the newly cleaned panes, casting long bands of brightness across the tiled floor. He had locked that door on the very day she was taken away, and he had kept it locked for 3 winters, while this letter lay less than 10 paces from him, waiting. He lowered his face, his shoulders began to tremble, and this time, he didn't turn his back to hide from anyone. That summer, the Ash Grove greenhouse blossomed again. Adeline and Bernadette divided the planting beds between them, one separating the young seedlings while the other mixed the soil, and the cluster of white roses Rosalind had planted long ago was carefully pruned and propagated into more than a dozen new bushes, lining both sides of the walkway. Every afternoon brought the sound of water flowing from the old faucet, the soft clicking of pruning shears, and Mrs. Quinn grumbling that someone had overwatered the plants again. Rosie had learned to walk, with the unmistakable gait of a child still finding her balance, both arms held out to her sides as her feet took short steps across the sun-warmed tiles, and what she loved most was running back and forth between the 2 rows of flower pots, until she dropped onto her bottom and burst into delighted laughter. That day, Elias was carrying a bag of soil at the far end of the greenhouse, when he heard the patter of little feet coming toward him. The child wrapped her arms around his trouser leg, looked up, and spoke one perfectly round, perfectly clear word. The first word of her life. Daddy. He stood frozen in the middle of the walkway, the bag of soil still resting on his shoulder. At the other end, Bernadette turned her face away and wiped her eyes with the hem of her apron. That night, after the child had fallen asleep, Elias went to the greenhouse alone, opened the drawer beneath the propagation table, and placed Rosalind's letter inside. Then he removed the tarnished silver ring from his right hand, the ring he had turned whenever he struggled to contain his anger throughout those 3 winters, and laid it beside the letter. He closed the drawer without saying a word. Sometime later, on an ordinary afternoon, he called Adeline onto the porch and placed a stack of documents on the table. She opened them and found 3 things. The first was a formal employment contract in the name of Adeline Cross, including insurance and seniority calculated from the first day she had entered the house. The second was paperwork for a bank account in her name alone, an account from which no one but her could withdraw money. The third was an enrollment form and a receipt showing full payment of tuition for all 4 years of a social work degree, the very course of study she had been forced to abandon at the age of 20 because she no longer had the money to continue. She looked up at him, and he said only that he didn't want her to remain because she had nowhere else to go. He wanted her to have everything she needed to leave whenever she chose, and if, after receiving all of it, she still chose to stay, only then would he dare ask her a question. Adeline held the documents in her hands and gave him her answer at that very moment, without waiting for the question. The wedding took place in the greenhouse on a morning near the end of summer, with only a dozen or so guests. Emmett Doyle reluctantly agreed to officiate, muttering as he read that in 30 years of practicing law, he had never imagined he would one day find himself standing there. But when the ceremony ended, he was the one who applauded the loudest. Gideon Marsh stood in the front row and held Rosie throughout the entire ceremony, still as rigid as ever, as though afraid he might break her, and he was now the head of security for a completely legitimate shipping company, with transparent payroll records and health insurance for its employees. Bernadette Quinn remained at Ashgrove for the rest of her life, and she said she was finally able to sleep. Curtis Pruitt occasionally sent letters saying that his daughter had recovered and returned to work, and the names Adeline had brought into the light in court went on to have lives of their own. The outbuilding behind the mansion was renovated and became a place called Ashgrove House, offering free legal assistance to women who had been stripped of their documents, their accounts, and their own names. All 8 women on the list were found and helped, and many others came after them, more with every passing year. Adeline graduated, and she personally met with every new arrival because she understood better than anyone what it felt like to sit before a stranger and be unable to prove who you were. This story leaves us with something very simple. The greatest power in the world isn't making other people bow their heads when you pass, but helping someone who was taught that she was invisible believe again that she deserves to be seen. Sometimes saving a person requires neither strength nor money. Sometimes it requires only someone willing to stop and truly look into her eyes. And never lock the door leading to the things that are still alive, because life always holds another season of flowers in reserve for each of us, if only we still dare to open the door. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that together we can listen to more meaningful stories each day. How did Adeline and Elias's journey make you feel? We would be grateful if you left a few words in the comments so we could hear the honest emotions within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.